The Boy Who Helped a Stranger. Hey guys, welcome back to another drifting, half-whispered dive into the world of mildly interesting history and the soft chaos of human behavior. So grab a blanket, turn down whatever light is still bravely shining in your room, and just settle in. This is the kind of story you can fall asleep to. And honestly, if you do fall asleep halfway through, you're pretty much doing it right. I won't take it personally, I promise. Tonight, we're floating into a quieter corner of history. Not the usual banquet hall tragedies of collapsing royal bloodlines or the emotional instability of monarchs who really should have stayed home instead of ruling entire empires. No, tonight's story is about a small act of kindness, a boy who helped a stranger. But because this is me, and because I can't resist turning a simple tale into an unnecessarily long bedtime history commentary, we're going to slowly drift into the social world that shaped this story, the class structures, the expectations, and of course, the deeply awkward dynamics that come with people trying to be good in societies that didn't always reward it. Don't worry, there will still be light sarcasm. This is history. There's always room for sarcasm. So, let's settle in. A small town, a smaller boy, and a stranger too old to be this lost. Let's ease into the background first. Our main character, let's just call him Thomas, because nearly every child in historical Europe was named Thomas, John, or some unfortunate saintly name that guaranteed social confusion for centuries, was around 12 when he crossed paths with the stranger who would quietly shape his future. Thomas lived in one of those towns that historians love to call modest, which is code for a place so small that everyone knew your business before you even decided it was your business. These weren't glamorous settings, no marble palaces, no tapestries woven with tales of questionable royal triumphs. No, just streets lined with wooden homes that tilted slightly in whichever direction the wind felt like pushing them that week. You know, rustic charm, the phrase real estate agents would use centuries later when trying to justify charging too much for something crooked. Thomas came from a family that was neither poor nor wealthy. They just hovered in that vague middle zone where you're always hoping for good weather, reasonable wheat prices, and the dramatic avoidance of taxes, which historically were unavoidable and soul-crushing. His father was a cooper, meaning he made barrels. Barrels for beer, barrels for salted fish, barrels for wine, and occasionally barrels for reasons no one ever explained, because medieval people just really loved containers. Thomas spent his childhood running errands, avoiding chores, and occasionally being lectured for not taking life seriously enough, which is hilarious when you remember he was 12. But medieval parents were on a different schedule. At 12, you weren't a child. You were apparently a nearly grown member of society who could at any moment be apprenticed, betrothed, or blamed for literally anything. And this brings us to the stranger. The stranger who walked like his bones were tired of existing. The man who wandered into Thomas's life wasn't exactly a dramatic figure. He wasn't a knight. He wasn't a noble in disguise. He wasn't even one of those overly enthusiastic monks who roamed around spreading wisdom, mostly in the form of long speeches people tried desperately to escape. No, he was just an old man, a tired old man. The kind of old where every step sounds like it should come with an accompanying sigh. He arrived in town early one morning, wearing clothes that had seen more years than most of the vegetables in the marketplace. His boots were thin, his coat was travel-worn, and his beard was the kind that grew unevenly, like it couldn't decide whether aging gracefully was worth the effort. This old man, let's call him Alden, was clearly lost, the type of lost where you squint at buildings as if staring hard enough will magically turn them into the place you were trying to find. And of course, because humans have always been astonishingly consistent, most townspeople reacted exactly the way townspeople do today. They walked around him like he was an inconvenient pile of laundry that wasn't their responsibility. Medieval towns weren't exactly known for their customer service. Now, Thomas was on his morning errand, which, if we're being honest, probably wasn't going well. He had one job: deliver bread to a neighbor. Simple, straightforward. And yet, he was 12, so the bread was somehow already half-eaten. But as he crossed the square, he noticed Alden struggling with a small leather satchel that looked heavier than his entire existence. The old man set it down, sighed, picked it up, sighed again, and continued in a slow wobble that practically begged the universe for mercy. And this is the moment that makes this story worth telling centuries later. The moment that every historian looks at and goes, "Ah, yes, the rare instance where a human didn't act like a confused goat." Thomas walked over. The kindness that should have been normal, but somehow wasn't. Thomas didn't think of himself as especially kind. He wasn't the saintly type. He wasn't the sort of kid who went around helping strangers for fun. He mostly helped himself to extra slices of bread and then pretended the cat ate them. But something about Alden's slow, painful attempt to navigate the cobblestones must have triggered that part of the human brain that whispers, "Hey, maybe try not being awful today." So Thomas approached. "Sir, do you need help?" Alden looked up, surprised. People usually didn't offer help. In most towns, helping strangers was about as common as a king making a rational decision, meaning it could theoretically happen, but no one was holding their breath. Alden nodded slowly. "Yes, my boy, if it's not too much trouble." It was, technically, a lot of trouble. Thomas still had bread to deliver, chores to fail at, and a general reputation of unhelpfulness to maintain. But he didn't really think about any of that. He just took the satchel, slid it over his shoulder, and said, "Where are you headed?" Alden handed him a small piece of parchment with handwriting so shaky it looked like the ink quivered out of fear. It listed an address on the far edge of town. Thomas sighed internally, because of course it was the far edge. The universe loves giving 12-year-olds inconvenient tasks. Still, he nodded, and the two began walking. Alden moved slowly, painfully slowly, the kind of slow that would make snails feel smug. But Thomas matched his pace. No rush, no annoyance, just calm acceptance of the fact that life occasionally demands patience in the most random moments. And this simple act, walking beside an old man, was the start of everything. They talked as they walked. Well, Alden talked. Thomas mostly listened, because listening is the easiest chore a child can do without being asked to redo it. Alden spoke about his hometown, his younger days, how he used to travel for work but hadn't done so in years, and how recently life had nudged him to make one last journey. Something about unfinished business, though he never explained it. Thomas didn't push. Kids in that era were not the ask deep questions type. They were more like the nod politely and hope the conversation ends soon so you can go back to doing nothing type. But the walk continued, and eventually, after what felt like 7 eternities and a half, they reached a small, quiet house. Alden stopped, breathing heavily. "This is it," he whispered. Thomas set the satchel down. Alden reached into his tote pocket. Now, this is the moment in most stories where the old man dramatically reveals a bag of gold or some symbolic token.
Quiet years, quiet hopes, and the stranger who wasn't finished yet. Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you drifted off for a bit and woke up because your phone slid off your chest, also congratulations. You're experiencing this series exactly the way it was meant to be consumed. Let's ease back into Thomas's life. We left him somewhere around the tender age when society expected him to instantly become a functioning adult, which is to say, completely unprepared, mildly confused, and still uncertain about bread delivery protocols, even though he was no longer responsible for them. Now, before we move forward, let's settle back into that slow, gentle pace. Deep breath. Good. Let's drift on. Thomas learns the art of being an adult, which mostly means pretending. Thomas's apprenticeship with the Merchant Guild was, like most entry-level opportunities in medieval towns, equal parts education and persistent bewilderment. His days began early, usually with someone shouting from across the market square that the fish cart had arrived, which meant the entire town now smelled faintly like ocean regret. Thomas learned quickly that being an adult wasn't glamorous. It was mostly carrying things heavier than your will to live, listening to older men argue about grain prices for 3 hours, and pretending to care about the quality of imported wax. But Thomas wasn't miserable. He actually enjoyed the work in a quiet, unambitious way. His merchant master, a man named Gregory, was the sort of employer who operated steadily between mildly grumpy and mildly tired, which made him one of the more stable figures in Thomas's life. Gregory wasn't wealthy exactly, but he had enough assets to feel important at market meetings, and enough sense not to get into unnecessary trouble. He cultivated the personality of a man who had given up on being impressive, and therefore had become vaguely admirable. Thomas learned bookkeeping, negotiation, and the very medieval art of pretending to understand foreign accents when foreign traders showed up with goods and the confidence of people who slept on actual feather mattresses. But deep under all that learning, Thomas still carried that memory, the dusty little moment when he walked with Alden across town. Not because it was dramatic, just because it was the kind of memory that stays soft in the corners of your mind. Now, let's drift over to Alden. The old man had not gotten younger, which is disappointing but historically accurate. Instead, he continued to live in the quiet house Thomas had helped him reach years before. His routines were predictable, which in medieval towns counted as luxury. He woke early, walked slowly, and tended to a garden that produced vegetables with the enthusiasm of a depressed rabbit. And occasionally he showed up at market, usually buying exactly the same things: 3 apples, 1 small loaf of rye bread, and a dried fish he inspected like it owed him money. Alden's life had an atmosphere of stillness. Not loneliness, just stillness. He didn't make friends. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't join guild meetings or attend church festivals or gossip loudly about who was secretly marrying whom, which was the medieval version of entertainment. He simply lived, quietly, calmly, unnoticed. And because this is medieval history, that alone made him suspicious to about 12 people. No one truly understood where he'd come from, why he'd moved into town, or why he seemed entirely uninterested in the social theatrics that everyone else invested their entire personalities into. People speculated, of course, because speculation was the national pastime. Some said he was a retired scholar. Others whispered he'd been a healer. One person insisted he'd once been a royal advisor, but given that this person also believed pigs could smell sin, we won't take their views too seriously. But whatever Alden had been, he wasn't that anymore. And Thomas hardly thought of him until fate quietly poked its head back into the story. Thomas faces the inevitable, finding his place in society. By his mid-20s, Thomas had become a reliable, if still slightly distracted, merchant companion. He wasn't brilliant, but he had that dependable energy of a man who kept showing up even when he wasn't entirely sure why. Which, historically, is how most careers happened. Gregory eventually trusted him with larger tasks, managing inventory, taking careful notes on trade disputes, and traveling to nearby towns to buy wool, which was basically medieval gold. And Thomas did all of this without becoming a menace, which, again, placed him well above average for the era. But then came the inevitable. Gregory began talking about Thomas's future. "You'll want your own shop eventually," Gregory said one morning, sipping a cup of ale, even though it was barely sunrise. Thomas nodded, the way you nod when someone says something sensible but terrifying.
"You'll want your own shop, eventually," Gregory said one morning, sipping a cup of ale, even though it was barely sunrise. Thomas nodded, the way you nod when someone says something sensible but terrifying. "You'll need capital, connections, a guild sponsorship." Of course he would, because medieval economies loved putting young people into bureaucratic obstacle courses long before such things became fashionable. Thomas wasn't wealthy, his family wasn't influential, and the guild didn't hand out sponsorships the way modern influencers hand out discount codes. So Thomas did what any overwhelmed young adult in history would do. He quietly panicked and did nothing. For months he worked, saved a little coin, worried, saved a little more, worried again, and generally existed in that limbo between ambition and dread. He wanted stability. He wanted independence. He wanted a shop where he didn't have to explain why grain shipments were late because, frankly, no one ever knew why grain shipments were late. But there was no path forward until the stranger reappeared. Alden's quiet decline and an unexpected correspondence. Around this time, the townspeople noticed that Alden was slowing down again, not in the "I'm old and move at the pace of a gentle breeze" way, but in the "my joints have formally resigned from service" way. His market visits became less frequent. His garden remained half-tended. His once daily walks turned into short shuffles from door to fence post. A few neighbors tried to check on him, but Alden wasn't the chatting type. He thanked them politely, insisted he was fine, and closed his door with the same quiet dignity as someone who'd spent a lifetime learning how to be alone without being lonely. But age catches everyone eventually, even the ones who walk slowly enough to pretend it won't. And that winter, Alden sent a letter. This alone was unusual. Alden didn't write letters. No one wrote letters unless it was really important or they were exceptionally bored. The letter was addressed to Thomas. Thomas hadn't spoken to Alden in over a decade. He hadn't even seen him in months. So receiving the letter was like discovering a memory had grown hands and delivered itself to your door. Inside, written in the same shaky handwriting Thomas remembered from childhood, were a few sentences. "Dear Thomas, if you have time, I would appreciate your company. I have a matter to discuss. Alden." That was it. No clues, no context, just a gentle request that somehow felt heavier than any satchel Thomas had ever carried. Being the sort of person who could never refuse an old man's request, especially one tied to a warm memory, Thomas went immediately. The conversation that set everything in motion. Alden's house was dim when Thomas arrived, but everything about the place looked exactly the same as years ago. The same neat shelves, the same small table, the same air of quietness that made the room feel like it existed slightly outside of time. Alden sat by the window. He looked smaller, not frail exactly, but like a man who had surrendered some part of himself to the passage of years. "Thomas, I wasn't sure you'd come." "Of course I came," Thomas replied, taking a seat. Alden nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "I wanted," he said slowly, "to thank you, properly." Thomas frowned, because the idea of being thanked for something he'd done as a half-distracted child seemed absurd. "You helped me once, when I was a stranger, when no one else did." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't do anything special." Alden chuckled. "Kindness is always special, especially when the world grows tired of practicing it." There was a pause, a long, gentle pause, filled with the kind of silence that has weight. Then Alden reached beside him and lifted a stack of papers. "I'm leaving this town soon, one way or another," which was the most polite way anyone had ever referred to their impending mortality. "These," he continued, handing Thomas the papers, "are documents, deeds, records. I would like you to keep them safe." Thomas blinked. "Why me?" Alden answered simply, "Because people show who they are in small moments, and you showed me who you were." It took Thomas a long time to respond. He wasn't used to being trusted with anything more valuable than a sack of beans. I don't know what to say," Thomas finally whispered. "You don't need to say anything," Alden replied. "Just keep them, and when the time comes, use them." And that was the entire conversation. Short, simple, unassuming. The kind of moment that feels small at the time, but grows in significance like ivy taking over an old wall. Thomas left with the documents. He didn't fully understand them. He didn't know what Alden meant. He just tucked them away safely and went back to life. And then, only a few weeks later, Alden passed away. Quietly, gently, predictably, like a candle that had just run out of wax. The town reacts, or mostly doesn't. News of Alden's death spread through the town with the emotional intensity of someone announcing that a local bridge needed minor repairs. People acknowledged it, nodded solemnly, and then returned to their lives. He had no family, no close friends, no dramatic final wishes. A few neighbors attended the burial. The priest said a few words. The sky was unremarkably gray. And that was it. Alden slipped into the ground with the same quietness he had lived in. No one knew about the documents. No one asked Thomas about them. No one even remembered that Thomas had helped Alden years ago. But Thomas remembered, and he kept the papers tucked away, uncertain why they mattered. He would find out soon enough. because Alden's story wasn't over, and Thomas's life was about to shift in ways he never expected. But we'll drift into that later.
Paper secrets, quiet surprises, and the merchant who didn't expect any of this. Welcome back. If your eyes are a little heavier or you're breathing a little slower, that's perfect. This entire script is basically an endurance test in relaxation. And if you're still awake, I applaud you. If you're not, well, future you can always rewind. Let's glide back to Thomas. We left him standing in the gentle aftermath of Alden's passing, with a stack of mysterious documents and a growing sense that life had just handed him a responsibility he never asked for. So let's float back into that moment, slowly, like a loose feather drifting across an empty room. The documents sit and sit and sit some more. After Alden's death, Thomas didn't immediately dive into the stack of papers he had been given, not because he wasn't curious, but because life had an annoying habit of distracting him at every turn. For a few weeks, things were busy. Gregory needed him for inventory. The market had a brief scandal involving mislabeled cheese, and someone spread a rumor that the baker's youngest child could see ghosts, a rumor the baker loudly denied until people stopped buying bread. So the documents remained tucked away in a wooden box under Thomas's bed, resting between a spare shirt and a broken quill he kept for absolutely no reason. But eventually, one evening, after a long day of work and an even longer lecture from Gregory about proper ledger notation, Thomas sat down at the rickety table in his small room. He lit a candle. He opened the box. And he finally pulled out the documents. He expected something simple, maybe a will, maybe a note, maybe that single coin Alden tried to give him all those years ago because the man seemed that consistent. Instead, he found papers thicker than anything he had ever handled. The ink was faded, the edges frayed, and several sheets bore wax seals that had cracked with age. What Thomas held wasn't just a stack of papers. It was, unmistakably, land deeds. Land. Actual land. The most valuable thing in medieval society after a functioning well and a spouse who didn't steal your blankets at night. Thomas stared at them for a long time, partly because he didn't understand all the legal terminology. Mostly because the idea of owning anything other than his boots felt deeply unrealistic. He kept reading. These weren't deeds for a patch of garden or a small rocky field no one wanted. They were deeds for farmland outside a neighboring town, a small orchard, and this was the truly shocking one. A stretch of riverside property. Thomas blinked. Twice. Slowly. Then he looked around the room as if expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Surprise!" No one did, which made sense because this was real life, and real life rarely sends people to jump out from behind furniture for dramatic effect. So, who exactly had Alden been? Thomas didn't sleep much that night, nor did he reach any conclusions. He simply turned the papers over and over again, absorbing the fact that the quiet old man who bought 3 apples every week had been a landowner. People with land were not average. People with land were not forgotten. People with land did not normally live in small houses at the edge of random towns. Unless, of course, something had gone wrong. And if there was one thing medieval history excelled at, besides dramatic plagues and confusing tax systems, it was things going wrong for people who didn't deserve it. Thomas went to work the next morning in a daze. Gregory tapped the table 3 times before Thomas realized he'd been staring at a sack of flour like it held the secrets of the universe. "You're distracted," Gregory muttered, in the exact tone someone uses when pointing out that water is wet. "I know," Thomas said. "I had a long night." Gregory squinted at him. "Are you sick?" "No." "Did you fall in love?" "No." "Then what else is there?" Thomas shrugged helplessly. He wasn't sure how to explain. "A man I barely knew left me enough land to be considered a small lord." So he said nothing. And Gregory didn't pry, because Gregory only liked prying when the subject involved grain fraud. But the paper stayed in Thomas's thoughts all day, whispering possibilities, humming with unanswered questions. And eventually, he knew what he needed to do. He needed to visit the local records office, which in this period was less office and more a dim room run by one elderly clerk holding civilization together with exactly 3 quills and pure stubbornness. The clerk who knew too much, and also too little. The clerk was a man named Robin, which was ironic because he had the personality of someone who had never robbed anything except joy. He was short, round, perpetually annoyed, and knew more about land disputes than any human ever should. When Thomas entered, Robin didn't look up. "State your business," he muttered, as if reciting a lifelong complaint. I need help understanding some land records." Robin looked up now. He stared. He sighed. He motioned for Thomas to approach. "Who gave you these?" Robin asked after the first glance. "A man named Alden," Thomas said. Robin's eyebrows rose half an inch, which, for Robin, was equivalent to a full gasp. "Alden," he repeated, tapping a finger on the table. "Alden of Grayford?" Thomas shrugged. "He never gave a last name." Robin stared at him with the expression of a man watching someone attempt to use a spoon to hammer nails. "He had a last name," Robin said. "Everyone has a last name." "Not in this town," Thomas muttered. Robin ignored that and flipped through the papers. "These records are old," he said. "Older than you, older than him, probably." Thomas nodded. Robin continued. "This land belonged to a family known as the Rains. Wealthy, respected. A family that, well," he paused, then added bluntly, "had terrible luck." Which honestly described about 90% of medieval families. Thomas leaned closer. "What happened to them?" Robin shrugged lightly. "A feud, a lawsuit, a bad harvest, some debts, a relative who made unfortunate marriage choices." Translation: chaos. "Did Alden belong to that family?" Thomas asked. Robin studied the handwriting more closely. He nodded once. "Yes, Alden Rain. I thought he'd died years ago." He paused, then added with the subtle flair of a man delivering gossip he'd been saving for decades. "He left town after losing most of the estate. People said he wandered for years, refusing to accept help." Thomas swallowed slowly. This was not the man he'd walked with as a child. Not the quiet old figure moving like a shadow through the market. This was someone with a history, a past, a story far bigger than his small house suggested. "And he left all this to me?" Thomas whispered. Robin shrugged lightly. "Stranger things have happened. Actually," he corrected himself, "they really haven't. This is extremely odd. You must have made quite an impression on him." Thomas didn't argue. He didn't know what he had done.
He had simply helped a man once without expecting anything. But life had remembered. Robin handed the papers back. "If you want to claim this property, you'll need to present these records to the magistrate in Grayford." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's, another town," he said, as if geography weren't obvious. "Yes." "A day's journey?" "Yes." "And complicated?" Robin snorted, painfully. Thomas sighed softly. Of course it was. Nothing in medieval society was ever simple unless it involved chickens. Gregory reacts in the only way Gregory is capable of. That evening, Thomas returned to Gregory's workshop and for the first time told him everything. The merchant listened silently, arms crossed, eyebrows raised so high they nearly escaped his forehead.